Welcome to South Harmon, we glad you here today. Another AMA. Welcome to South Harmon, we glad you here today.
Hello, and welcome into another Dynasty Team review. Today we have Poil asking me, Koopa, to look at a 10-team Start 11 lineup league that he's in. Before we get into it, just a reminder that you can get your own team review at dynastyteamreview.com, or you can head over to the website and check out all the cool tools that we have to offer. We've got the Warp tool, which we'll be heavily utilizing, the lab, which shows you all the information about your league, or you can even head over to the Patreon and get yourself signed up and join our Discord community. So let's get started into what the Warp tool says about Poil's team. So this is the league that he has us looking at. It's called Dynasty QC. And as I mentioned before, it is a 10-team Start 11. So already 10-team quarterbacks are not worth as much because even though it is Superflex, you don't quite have the scarcity that you have in a 12-team league. And then on top of that, it's Start 11. You need to start even more wide receivers and running backs. So that's just going to up the value of those wide receivers and running backs when it compares to the quarterback position. So let's look at, okay, how would I potentially go about building a team in this league? So you can see there's still the top 4 quarterbacks. I always like to start looking at quarterback because that's the position that will last the longest. If you have Josh Allen right now, you aren't expecting that even within the next 5 years that he's going to no longer be like at the very least a top 12 quarterback or something like that for you. And then so we look here, we've got Josh Allen. He's the number 1 quarterback, and he's still position rank 4. So that even though it's a 10 team, even though the other positions are boosted just because they have a little bit more of a scarcity to them, Josh Allen's still the 4th best player in the league. So in terms of longevity, I'd like to be able to have Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, Lamar Jackson. Dak Prescott's starting to get up there in age, but treat this like, okay, who is the 4th best quarterback? In my mind, in a league like this, it might be Anthony Richardson, because he has such a high rushing floor. And what's the commonality between all these guys? They've got that huge rushing floor. But I'd be looking to have at least one of those guys if I want to have an edge at the quarterback position. If I can have 2, that's great. But otherwise, try to find a balance where either you decide I want to have an advantage at quarterback, in which case you get one of these 4, or you can kind of live down here in this whole 5 through 17 range. It doesn't really matter too much who you have in that range, because everyone else is going to be relatively close. Even Patrick Mahomes was down in this range last year. If he gets some better receiving weapons, maybe he bumps back up to the top quarterback range, but maybe not. With the way the defenses are playing the Chiefs, they're kind of just making it so the Chiefs have to slowly grind the game as opposed to doing the big plays that they were known for a couple of years ago. So if I'm going to end up, say, have 2 of my quarterbacks in this 5 through 17 range, you need to have a difference somewhere. And that difference is not going to come from the tight end position. The tight ends they do not have a premium in this league, and they are just not very good at all when it comes to warp. So I'm just going to punt tight end almost entirely. I mean, even Travis Kelce was the number 1 warp tight end, and he's has 15 running backs and receivers better than him on the season. And as soon as you jump down to the second tier, you're now at, okay, I've got 28 receivers and I've got 22 running backs better already than tight end 3, which was Sam Laporta. So I'm not going to invest much in the tight end position at all. This is very much a league where I'm going to do my tight ends don't matter strategy. And I'm going to end up with whatever tight ends nobody's willing to pay me something for. It's only a 10-team league, and so everybody only needs one. So realistically, like, I might end up with a Dalton Schultz. I might end up with a Cole Kmet or a Jake Ferguson, or I mean, Dallas Goedert's down here in Warp. Like, people might not want him. Kyle Pitts has a lot of stink on him after not producing the past few seasons. But you can also make it up with Hunter Henry, Darren Waller, Taysom Hill. Like, you can still insert those guys. And it becomes even more stark when we look at a warp per game. You can see here that there's really a top 10 and then it drops. Well, what do you know? There's 10 teams in this league. Uh, so that works out quite nicely. Everybody can get one person from where the difference between having the best tight end versus the 10th best tight end is in warp per game 0.03. That means best case scenario, you have the best tight end, assuming everyone else also has the best tight end available. You only have a 3% chance of winning off of that. Whereas if you can lock yourself up one of these top tier quarterbacks, one of these top tier receivers or running backs, now you have a much, much, much larger advantage just by virtue of how much higher that warp per game is. You can get yourself even a 10% advantage. Like if we look at Christian McCaffrey versus Travis Etienne, that's an 8% advantage just from having one guy over the other. And both of those guys are still really, really good. But so I don't want to invest in the name of Travis Kelce, of TJ Hawkinson, Trey McBride, Sam Laporta, Mark Andrews. It's just not going to be worth it if I can match that production from somebody else. So I'm punting tight end. Quarterback, we're kind of doing it. Can I get one of these top guys? And so now that brings us to the final position to look at, or the final two, which is the running backs and the wide receivers. And so that's really where the meat of this league is, because of what I already mentioned about the quarterbacks, because how tight ends don't matter. So what I'm going to do is I'm actually going to click away. If you did not know about the Warp tool, if you click the tight end box here and the quarterback box here, now you are only looking at the running backs and wide receivers. And the reason I like doing this is because it allows me to get a little bit more of a view into, okay, without all the other fluff going on, how do I want to build my team around these positions? Because realistically, everything else is not going to matter. You're going to have maybe 2 tight ends on your team, if you even bother to do that. I'm a big proponent of just getting one, but I do know that this league, they roster like 30 players on the team, so I guess you can afford to have a second roster spot dedicated to a tight end. And the quarterbacks just kind of muddle things up at the bottom as well. So just by looking at wide receivers and running backs, all right, let's take a look at what we have going here. And this is where it starts to get interesting when you look at the A-warp graph versus A-warp per game. And the reason that I made A-warp per game is because of, in lineup leagues, you tend to have a lot of running backs that you know when their opportunity is going to strike. And so you start these backup running backs on weeks where they're going to matter. They have a good matchup and the starter's hurt. Or hey, this is just, they've been in a 50-50 backfield and they have a good matchup this week, so we're going to play them. And we tend to do a good job at predicting that. Wide receivers, we don't do as good of a job with that. If we have, say, the third wide receiver on the team, we're trying to predict, okay, is this week going to be Josh Downs this week? Or is this week going to be Allen Robinson's week? We're really bad at that. And so I like to use the combination of these two to help us figure out, okay, where is the right value for a running back that matters versus what I would almost call the dynasty running back dead zone. There's this idea in redraft of the running back dead zone is the running backs that are drafted 3 through 5 because everyone feels like they need a running back, so they overdraft them. But you kind of see that same thing in Dynasty where becomes a certain tier of running back where it doesn't actually matter who you have because even the guys that are starting every week are just as equivalent as the guys that are the backups. So I'll kind of show a little bit here what I mean by that. So here at the top, we have wide receiver and running back. Wide receiver is slightly better than running back. I tend to like investing in the wide receiver in that upper range, especially when wide receiver is better than running back, because they have a longer staying power. They have longer careers. You're going to be able to have them on your team longer for dynasty purposes, whereas the running backs, that value is going to crater in 2 to 3 years. No matter who it is that you have, you might still be scoring points, but the value is going to go down. Whereas if you have a wide receiver, you can still have some amount of value in order to get out of them if the rest of your team is falling apart. Or hopefully that wide receiver sticks around an extra couple of years and you have an extra couple of years to make a move for championship window. So we've got CeeDee Lamb, Tyreek Hill, Amon-Ra, Keenan Allen, Mike Evans, A.J. Brown, DJ Moore. Your usual suspects from 2023 of who was the best in Warp. I'd be focusing on those guys. You can maybe lower Keenan Allen because he's getting up there in age, but if you get an Amon-Ra, CeeDee Lamb, and A.J. Brown, Justin Jefferson had a pretty poor year because of his missed time and the quarterback struggles there in Minnesota and all that stuff. Focus on those guys. That's another good way to build your team. And then the running backs, it's a who's who of randomness, essentially. You have Christian McCaffrey. He's still really, really good, and he's going to be really, really good until the wheels fall off. Raheem Mostert, he's an old guy, and that could fall off in a year. Travis Etienne, he was looking good. He's still kind of young, but in a year, his value is going to crater. I would much rather invest in an Amon-Ra St. Brown in terms of getting the warp value, but obviously we know that Amon-Ra is going much earlier than Travis Etienne in startups, so you kind of have to weigh that a little bit in terms of the value that you're putting into the position. But as we get into wide receiver 7 versus running back 7, they kind of stay in pretty close lockstep all the way down until they start to split apart somewhere in the early 20s. And so you can kind of use that to help you identify that, okay, I can, especially with how ADP is working in startups and things like that, and how values are. You can invest in the wide receivers a little bit earlier and get the running backs a little bit later. But once you start to get to the point where you're seeing running back 20 go off the board, you're going to want to start shying away from running backs because the wide receivers are a much flatter line. You can continue to invest in them. So you can get these Jacoby Myers and your Rasheed Rices, Calvin Ridleys, George Pickens, Cooper Kupp. Although Cooper Kupp's still, he has some name value there, but Terry McLaurin, Tyler Lockett, those guys you can invest in, and they're going to do better than most of these running backs. So why am I saying stay away from the running backs in this range where you're 24 to 36 and on? Well, the reason is because of a warp per game. And so I'm going to pull that up and now look at what a warp per game tells us of running backs versus wide receivers. They stay in lockstep for way longer. If we look at, okay, where did they start to separate? It's really all the way down at like 42 to even longer. They're still pretty close before they finally start to go negative. And the reason that I'm missing out on those running backs in the range of 24 to 42 from a full A-warp perspective is those tend to be the guys that are not doing as well in terms of a backfield situation. They have a heavily split backfield, or they just have a team that is not doing very well. So you can see we have Ramondre Stevenson, James Conner. They were both having really rough seasons. Najee, split backfield. Zach Moss, split backfield. Jonathan Taylor missed a bunch of the season. Jalen Warren, he's the guy that split it with Najee Harris. Look at the two of them just cannibalizing each other and ending up in this 26 to 29 range. Chuba Hubbard kind of came out of nowhere towards the end, but still wasn't doing a whole lot at the beginning of the season. That was a pretty uncertain backfield. Same with Javonte, uncertain backfield. Zeke splitting his time with Ramondre, and so they were cannibalizing each other. Devin Singletary. So all these guys have some amount of stink on them. And that's going to crater their dynasty value. So maybe if you need some spot starts, those are the guys you can go target with like your third round picks or something. But those aren't the guys that I'm going to try and invest in. I want to try to get these wide receivers because they're going to be more likely to stay up in this range, and as opposed to these running backs that are kind of on this downslope and can very easily fall into this steeper downslope here. And with a warp per game, I can snag some more interesting guys that, okay, maybe I can get somebody to actually participate in my lineup. So I have a Zamir White here at running back 29 in warp per game. Devon Achane, he was injured a bunch. He's worth a lot, but he was up here. He was up here in this range, pretty flat range, really, of running backs that were able to produce some warp. Like the difference between 18 and 32 is pretty negligible when it comes to warp. And so, if we look at that, it's actually a 1% difference all the way down from 32 to 18. Like that's nothing. So if I can fill this on a week-to-week basis, I can get Clyde Edwards-Helaire, Devin Singletary, James Conner, Jerome Ford, although he played most of the season, but so Gus Edwards, Zamir White. Like there's names in here that actually you can recognize, like, yeah, that guy only played a couple times. And that's how you can kind of help fill out your lineup. And if you're smart enough, even Deonta Foreman is all the way up there at rank 13. Like you'll find some gems here and there of guys that are really, really good for what you're looking for. And I like to invest in a ton of those backup running backs, especially backups where there's a clear role to them being the starter if the starter gets hurt. And as opposed to the guys that are like splitting time pretty regularly, because then you kind of feel compelled to start them sometimes. Like I don't ever want to feel compelled to start a running back unless it's one of these top tiers, Travis Etienne, Saquon Barkley's, Christian McCaffrey, Raheem Mostert guys. And that's how I'm going to invest in the running back position. So I can maybe get myself a couple of these top guys, but really focus in on avoiding this dead zone in the middle and get a lot more of the guys that are on a smaller per game basis, but can really come in and nail in your lineup. And so that's where you've probably heard it mentioned as the NERB on a 53 strategy. Like that sort of thing is extremely powerful in this kind of league if you can get the wide receivers to support the rest of your team. And so that's where I'm getting into this wide receivers. I want to try and get as many of these top tier wide receivers as I can. This is a kind of league that, if I turn back the quarterbacks on here for a second, if I don't like where Jaden Daniels goes, and like say Jaden Daniels ends up in New England, like a place that I'm not too excited for him to go to, I would advocate for Marvin Harrison Jr. to be the 101, because if Jaden Daniels is the only one that has the rushing ability to get up into this true difference maker position at the quarterback, and Marvin Harrison Jr., in order to be above like quarterback 5, he only needs to be wide receiver 10. Like we're talking generational prospect here. Like he doesn't need to be wide receiver 2. Like he can miss on being the top fantasy wide receiver and just be a solid wide receiver one, and he's better than any quarterback that you can get. So that's the uh, that's the sort of thing where you have to recognize your league and what's going to be ideal. Like it, and then you have Malik Neighbors, who everyone's saying he would be the 101 in this class, but like by far, or the first wide receiver off the board in this class by far, if it weren't for the fact that Marvin Harrison Jr. was there. Well, I might even say if I don't like where Jaden Daniels goes, Marv 101 and Neighbors 102. Like that's not that hard of a decision for me. And as we look at it later, Poil said that he got himself the 102 off of making a trade a little bit earlier, either sometime this month or before he sent in the review. So I would advocate trying to get a wide receiver off of that as opposed to investing it in a quarterback, because those quarterbacks you can run off of a couple of guys in this range, and the true difference makers are the wide receivers and trying to get as many that will land up here. You still want a bunch of guys that will land in this lower range of receivers, but it's not necessarily, oh, this is what I need for sure out of all of these difference makers. Like quarterbacks, wide receiver in this range is better, but I want as many shots as getting up here in this difference maker because that's what's going to make my team. So why don't we turn over and take a look at what we have going on in the actual team. So we'll come over to the lab and we will pull up Poil's username. And I said this last time, I'm going to stalk every person that I put in. Poil, this is his only league, so all right, I'm probably not going to have to worry too much here. He does have 2 open roster spots. That's probably as a result of the trade that he made, but he doesn't have waivers open. So he doesn't need to fix it because he can't fix it. So he's doing a good job. It looks like he was fully filled on his roster, and the trade he ended up making was Purdy, Ayuk, and Ford for 3 picks. One of them being the 102, the other being the 206, and a 25 third. So so it looks like maybe he was even one over, or he's made another trade that filled in another roster spot. Waivers aren't open, so you just kind of got to work with what you got to work with. And then even if we go back over to the warp tool, if we look at the available players, there's like nobody on waivers, and that's like you got Tyler Higbee as the best guy on waivers, and he just tore his ACL. So everyone else was a negative player from last year, and so not even like there's really that many people that you want to go for on waivers. That would maybe be a backup running back or a backup quarterback kind of situation there. So heading back over to the lab, let's take a look at what this team is that we have. So we've got rock solid quarterbacks. We've got Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts. I love that as the 1-2 because both of those guys were on that actual difference making section at the quarterback position. And having 2 of them, you're probably going to be the only team in the league that has 2 of them. So even though quarterback is a little bit more muted, if this was a 12-team start 9, like you'd be looking real good with those 2 quarterbacks. It's not quite as good in the 10-team start 11, but it goes a long way towards helping you for sure. It can make up with some holes. We're going to have an intentional hole at tight end essentially, and an intentional hole at running back. But overall, like that's going to help make it up is having those quarterbacks, and so you can rely on those quarterbacks to maybe make it so you don't need to try and get Justin Jefferson and CeeDee Lamb and Marvin Harrison Jr. in order to have a difference at wide receiver. Maybe you only need to get one of those guys, or you can make it up with a bunch of the wide receiver 4 through 12 guys or something like that. So, quarterback position, you have those two, and then for backups, you've got Aiden O'Connell, probably not starting next year. Trey Lance, probably not starting next year. Huntley, definitely not. Gabbert, definitely not. So, and Matt Corral, definitely not as well. So, you only have those two as your starters. So, and then your backups, you've got 5 of them, but as we're going to talk a little later in terms of what else you have on your team, I think you probably are going to need to do a little bit of either seeing if somebody's willing to trade, like a quarterback who's going to start the season but won't be great for a third, or just pick up a bunch of backups and hope you get lucky. And because you'll need somebody to cover the bye weeks, so it's not really that much of a priority to get yourself a third quarterback right now. It's definitely not something I feel like you need to do before August unless something falls into your lap. But otherwise, I'm gonna roll with Josh Allen, Jalen Hurts, and maybe free up a couple roster spots to get a couple more backups, just in case you can luck yourself into not having to spend any draft capital in order to get yourself a quarterback to fill in for those bye weeks. So next, I'm going to run over the tight end position because I want to see if I can free up any roster spots now that we've discussed, hey, we might want to have a couple more of those open quarterback spots. We've got Dallas Goedert, and then we've got Dalton Schultz. So already right there, I can tell this is somebody who's listening to what we've been talking about. I already mentioned that Goddard and Schultz are two tight ends that are right in that range of, yeah, they're probably worse than anybody else's tight ends. So are you really going to get them to pay anything for them? So I would be open to, hey, if somebody comes knocking on your door and you can sell them Goddard or Schultz for, I don't know, a back end second, an early third, and even a mid third, realistically, because it's a 10 team, like, I'll just go ahead and do it because it's something extra and I don't really need that value stored into my tight end position. But it's going to be hard to find somebody to do that. And Poil even mentioned in his notes that it's not an easy league to trade with. The only one that he has some luck trading with is somebody who listens to the same content. So guess what? If you're listening to this content and you're seeing, oh, I'm roster constructed properly with only 2 tight ends, well, you're going to have a hard time selling any of those tight ends because they're all also listening to the tight ends don't matter strategy. So I think tight ends, roster-wise, you are constructed well there. So let's see if we can find some spots to fill in at the wide receiver position. So what I'm looking here at wide receivers is we've got a bunch of good, I'll call them like tier 2 guys. So guys that are not in the top 10 but are still making a contribution. So Michael Pittman just outside the top 10, Devonta Smith just outside, Nico Collins just outside. Although we'll see longer term what Nico is with how the receivers are there. Harry McLaurin, Keenan Allen, those are some other good options. And then if we come all the way down here, we've got Cortland Sutton, Mike Williams, Khalil Shakir, Rashad Bateman, Charlie Jones. So realistically, the number of wide receivers that we need is I want to be able to fill all my wide receiver spots. I want to be able to fill all my flex, and I want to have a few extra. So I am going to try and aim for 8 or 9. Warp is probably going to tell us to aim around that number. And Warp actually tells us to aim for 7.7. So I may be going a little bit higher than Warp just because I like to have a little bit of flexibility for when injuries come, when bye weeks come, things like that. And especially in a league like this, where I'm trying to stretch the wide receiver position, get as much value out of it as I can. I want to try and get up to 8 or 9. But it's important that they all end up in this higher range. So if I can get my wide receivers before it starts to fall down this slope, and more specifically before it starts to fall down the slope in AWARP per game. So if we look at AWARP per game, there seems to be a point somewhere around here in this 50 to 60 range where it starts to fall apart. It's 66. There's a big jump down that is equivalent to a full percent of a loss, or a full percent of a loss of your chance to win each week. And maximum, there's only 76 or 77 players a season that are even a value to your team in terms of when you started them. So I'm not going to go for 7 players in this whole range. Instead, what I'm going to do is I'm going to say, all right, I want to try and see if I can get 8 players in this top 50 or so. And the reason I can aim for 8 in that top 50 is because I am punting a little bit at the running back position. I've been punting at the tight end position, and same with the quarterback position, except for the fact that we've got Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts on this team. So we aren't really punted there. And you might be tempted to try and take Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts and turn them into a couple wide receivers to make some differences at that at those positions. And I'm just not really a fan of that. I like to have a position that I can dominate the league with. In this one, if you have the number 1 and number 2 quarterbacks, that's your big edge. And then I can try and match as much as possible at wide receiver. I can try to match the value as well as I can at running back. And that's how I'm going to end up winning. So I would not be looking to sell Jalen Hurts or Josh Allen unless anybody's coming to give you what I would essentially equate to a Godfather offer. And as said in the notes, the league doesn't really value quarterbacks. I don't necessarily see that coming. And I can kind of see that in terms of how you have two of the top guys. Like, all right, I'm fine with that. Just give me Josh Allen, give me Jalen Hurts, and I'll just roll from there. So I'm mentioning 8 or 9 guys up in that range. The problem that I have with your current roster construction at the wide receiver position is I do not count Charlie Jones in that range. I do not count Rashad Bateman in that range. I have a really hard time justifying Khalil Shakir and Mike Williams in that range as well. Mike Williams, just with his injury history, when he is there, he does well, assuming he's in LA next year, assuming that they're actually passing the ball enough to make a difference for him. I mean, Jim Harbaugh is known for having a run-heavy team, focusing a lot on the defense. The wide receivers just aren't going to do as well for fantasy. Khalil Shakir, his situation is essentially he's the second best wide receiver in Buffalo, but Buffalo has not shown that they are confident in him at all. I mean, they give him the ball because they need someone to give the ball to, but it's taken him forever to get there. They've given Gabe Davis how many chances in order to hold on to that wide receiver 2 spot to get a ton of targets. So any of Charlie Jones, probably you're going to have to end up cutting him. Rashad Bateman, can you get anything out of him? Like, I've noticed that you have up to 5th round picks. Maybe just if you can sell Rashad Bateman for a 4th or 5th round pick, I'd just do it. Just get out. If you can't even sell him for that and you can't get any fab or anything, cut him. Let somebody else step into that landmine and try to and waste a roster spot on him to allow you to have a bit of better roster construction and be focused in on the players that you want. So let's say we hold on to Cortland Sutton and Mike Williams down here on your bench. And we come up here, and then we've got Keenan Allen, Terry McLaurin, Michael Pittman, Nico Collins, Devonta Smith. So that's 7 of the 8 or 9. So, all right, already I'm saying, all right, we're just about one wide receiver short of my target, 1 or 2. Well, you said one of these picks here was the 102. I don't know what the other one is because it's not appearing. Probably because your league hasn't set the draft up with the right picks yet. But you get a Malik Neighbors or hopefully a Marv, but probably not likely if this league doesn't value the quarterbacks. So Malik Neighbors added in. There you go. That's your 8 or 9 that you need. So I like where this team is built in the number of wide receivers. The only problem I have is that you are missing out on the top tier. You don't have anybody in that true difference-making range unless Keenan Allen hits it again. There's a multitude of reasons. I've already mentioned some of them with Jim Harbaugh coming to LA, with the fact that Keenan Allen is so old, things like that where I would not bank on Keenan Allen being a top difference-making wide receiver this upcoming year. So because of that, you're going to need to try to find some sneaky way to bump yourself up. I would not be opposed to taking the second first-round pick that you have and tacking it on to Nico Collins and see if you can get yourself up into that range. Can you, depending on where that pick is, can you tack it on to Nico Collins and get yourself into the, maybe not the Amon-Ra range, but into A.J. Brown? Because if maybe you can get yourself a full Philly stack, Jalen Hurts, Devonta Smith, Dallas Goedert, and A.J. Brown. That would be one heck of a team there. If you can get something like that, bump yourself up into that top difference-making tier. I'm definitely all about that because that's kind of the thing that you're missing at the wide receiver position is just getting somebody up to match your quarterbacks in warp at the wide receiver position. The running backs that you have, so you have Kyren Williams. That's kind of the one guy that can be your top difference-making running back. Unless something drastically changes over there in LA, he's probably going to get a heavy workload again next year. We've known McVay, he likes to give heavy workloads to the running back he likes, and Kyren Williams seems to be the guy that he likes. So might as well ride him while you have him. And then I like what you have built at the rest of the running back position. So you have Nick Chubb, Charbonnet, and then you've got Warren, Singletary, Dobbins, Gray, Johnson, Patterson, Murray, Blackshear, Johnson, Taylor, Vaughn. Now, some of those guys are a little harder to stomach in terms of, okay, what is their path to playing? The ones mainly for that is I don't ever see Keyshawn Vaughn actually getting a shot. Ty Johnson started to get a shot at the end, so maybe he could. Blackshear, with all the craziness going down in Carolina, I'm just not excited about Blackshear. He's never really gotten a great opportunity over there. But we have some interesting guys as well. So Nick Chubb's coming back from an ACL. We don't know what Nick Chubb is going to do. So if we're looking at, okay, week 1, is Nick Chubb back? Is he looking good? How's that recovery going? If Nick Chubb's not ready to go, Jaylen Warren is our guy. And so you could have worse guys to go out there as your running back too. But the problem that I have with Jaylen Warren is you are banking on Najee Harris going down in order for him to get a ton of run and be able to carry the football and be a true difference maker at the running back position. But he's also not the kind of guy that's going to get as many. Like, if Najee Harris does go down, he's not going to absorb all of Najee's workload. He might absorb a little bit of it, but they'll bring in another running back, and that other running back's going to spell Jaylen Warren. So he's not as much of a priority for me as if I could get a really high value backup. And those change year to year, but this past year that would have been like a guy like Zach Moss, where when Jonathan Taylor was out, Zach Moss was doing a ton. He looked really good. When Ramondre Stevenson was out, Ezekiel Elliott, he looked really good. At least for fantasy purposes. I mean, he's still an old running back. He was on the Patriots. So problems there, of course. But I want to be looking in that sort of range of player, whereas Jaylen Warren doesn't quite fit that for me, but I can also understand why you'd want to have Jaylen Warren. Zach Charbonnet, he's in a similar boat of he's splitting time with Kenneth Walker. Kenneth Walker's clearly the lead back, but Charbonnet is going to spell him, but also get spelled even when he had um, the starting job to himself when Kenneth Walker was hurt. So like there's some balancing and some squinting that you have to do in order to figure out, are these guys actually going to be worth it in my lineup? And if I need to squint for if somebody is going to be worth it in my lineup, I tend to shy away from those guys, especially when they have some amount of value. So Zach Charbonnet and Jaylen Warren definitely have some amount of value because they're being drafted up in that range of, okay, this guy can go for a mid, since it's 10 team, probably a mid to late second round pick or something like that. So if I'm looking at, okay, maybe I'm making a trade, I'm trying to get one of these top tier wide receivers. Can I take Nico Collins? Because I personally think Nico Collins is overvalued. That's why I keep targeting him. But pick whichever wide receiver you don't want, who still has a good amount of value. Take Nico Collins, assuming that your other first is late. Let's say it's the 109. So take the Nico Collins, the 109, and see if you can get yourself an AJ Brown. See if you can get yourself a Tyreek Hill. And if the manager's like, I need something more, see if you can toss him Zach Charbonnet. See if you can toss him Jaylen Warren. Maybe that'll sweeten the deal enough to let that go through. And you aren't giving up much by giving those guys away, because even when you're starting them in your lineup, they aren't gonna be a huge difference maker for you. So that's how I like to take these pieces and turn them into something. They're the sweetener that I provide instead of a third round pick or something, because that guy's better than a third round pick. Like, I feel like I'm getting a deal by this guy not offering me a third. Whereas really you're holding on to your third. So when you get to week 9 and oh crap, I don't have a running back this week because none of my backups have hurt starters in front of them, and all the ones that do are on bye. Well, now you go out and you spend that third, and you get a running back to slot into your second running back spot from one of the guys that's not contending this year, and just happens to have somebody who's scoring points in their lineup when they don't even want those points being scored in their lineup. So that's how I like to play it, is to use them in lieu of that third round pick, that as a sweetener, in order to get a deal that's really important for you to get done. So going back down to these running backs, so Keyshawn Vaughn, Patrick Taylor, Ty Johnson, Raheem Blackshear, like, I just have a hard time justifying these guys. Cordero Patterson, same thing. I can't justify them. J.K. Dobbins is somebody that if you can get out on him, I am totally down with it. There's not many running backs who've ever come back from Achilles. J.K. Dobbins hasn't played in a few years. The Ravens have kind of figured out how to play without him just because he hasn't been on the field. And I don't think he's going to... It's a bad bet to make if you're investing in J.K. Dobbins. So if you can use him as a sweetener, absolutely do that. Um, but I also like how your draft picks are laid out. You've got a couple first round picks, which is very important because lineup leagues are top heavy. 10 team, top heavy. Consider that your 10 team start 11 is kind of similar to a 12 team start 9. And what do we know about that? It's if you have one guy who's a difference maker, that's worth a lot. So you want to have the first round picks over having your thirds, a bunch of thirds and fourths. I see you have a couple fifths here. That's great. You can take a couple flyers. So once we cut Charlie Jones, once we cut some of these running backs here, um, you'll have some open roster spots. You take a flyer and maybe you get lucky and you end up with next year's Puka Nakua. I'm not saying that there is a guy that looks like that. I'm not saying it'll even happen. We know from hit rates that drafting a guy in the third, fourth, fifth round, like the chance that even one of those guys actually means something in Dynasty, never mind the amount that Puka Nakua is worth, is just so astronomically low that you need to basically own the entire draft class if you want to guarantee your shot at getting one. So we just so you have a couple of those spots to put those new rookies on, and if I remember right, yeah, so you have 15 open taxi spots. That might just be a holdover for you. I don't know exactly what your league rules are, but it looks like since you have 15 open taxi spots, you utilize taxis at some point. So I just like to take advantage of, okay, just toss a couple of those guys on and just see. Because realistically, the guys here, if you drop them, you're going to be able to pick them up later. There's going to be other options just as equivalent that are on waivers for you to pick up. And so you can let a bunch of these guys just rotate on and off your team. Anytime there's a hype piece coming out of camp, I pay attention to the 32 beat writers guys. They're a content group. All they do is they read what all the beat writers post throughout training camp, and then they compile it into a list for you, so that way you can feel like you're there at training camp and know what's going on without having to pay attention to any of them. And so I liked reading what they say and using that to determine, like, oh, maybe they say Eric Gray has locked up. It looks like he's playing with the ones when Saquon needs a break. Not that Saquon's necessarily going to be there next year, but let's just pretend. Then okay, Eric Gray is the guy that I need to hold on to. And then they say, Miles Sanders is looking better this year than he was last year. He and Chuba Hubbard are splitting the backfield. All right, Raheem Blackshear is not a great person to continue holding on to if there's somebody else that's on waivers that they're talking about. Maybe there's some rookie that nobody had on their radar who is a UDFA who's getting a lot of run with one of the teams and is playing with the second team or something like that. Like, all right, that's the kind of guy that I might try to invest in, and I would potentially drop Raheem Blackshear for. So that's the kind of thing that I will do when I'm going through and being able to rotate these sorts of guys, and that happens during the season too. So the starter goes down. All right, let me just grab every running back on that team. Even if only, like, a lot of times this past season, it was the starter went down, the backup was owned, but then the third and fourth guys weren't owned. There were a couple teams where we found out that the guy that was the quote-unquote backup was not really the backup, and it was the guy third on the depth chart or the guy on the practice squad who ended up coming in and doing well. And so that's the sort of thing that you take a gamble on. It was the Rams when Kyron went down. What did they do? They went to the free agency and grabbed Darrell Henderson. Everyone was like, oh, there's no way that Darrell Henderson's going to be the guy. It's going to be Royce Freeman for sure. And I was one of the very few people. I picked up Darrell Henderson. I started him week 1 because I was convinced that Darrell Henderson was going to be the guy to get there, and he already knew the system. Like, he could step in immediately, whereas everyone else was saying, oh, he was a free agent before. And sure enough, it worked out for me because I went third, fourth running back on the depth chart, and that's how I ended up getting there. So take advantage of that, and keep all of those spots flexible. And as time goes on, yeah, you can stray a little bit from roster construction. There's a tight end that's doing something interesting. Like this past year, it was Tucker Kraft. Like if Tucker Kraft is starting to pop off towards the end of the season, pick up Tucker Kraft just to have him on your bench because who knows, maybe Dalton Schultz and Dallas Goedert go down, you've got one extra guy. And yeah, you're straying a little bit from roster construction, but during the season, it's fine to do that. During the off season, I like to stick pretty close to the roster construction, just so that way I know where I'm at going into the season, and you don't have that much that's really going to flex values up and down. During the season, values will flex up and down. You can take advantage of the fact that, oh, somebody has a good game and you might be able to sell them for something, literally anything, like a random fourth round draft pick again. Um, that's the sort of thing that I like to try and do and take advantage of during the season, just in using those flexible spots. So the last thing that was mentioned was that there was a bit of a super team building. Um, and that was Poil's primary question in terms of where should he be going with his team. So I looked through the teams, uh, and the team that I found was looking a little scary was this GP team here. So you can already tell when you see looking on their bench that they've got the 5'10 and 6'11 and 808 in startup drafts on their bench. So let's look through this team and let's talk about kind of my thoughts on contending while there's a super team in the league. So this team has Justin Herbert and Patrick Mahomes. So Patrick Mahomes is going to be up there with your quarterbacks. Like he's probably going to be able to match one of them. Although this past season he didn't really do that. So maybe not. Depends on how the Chiefs bounce back. I mean, they still won the Super Bowl this year with Patrick Mahomes not being a top quarterback for fantasy purposes. So there's not as much reason to believe that that's necessarily going to change for next year. His other quarterback, Justin Herbert, I already mentioned how the whole Jim Harbaugh thing. So Justin Herbert, probably a solid quarterback, 5 through 15. And what did I say in Warp? It isn't a huge difference there. So where this team is really good is its wide receivers. So they have CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, Puka Nacua. Those three are all guys that are in that wide receiver high warp range where it's a huge difference to have those guys over an average top tier wide receiver. It's not that average and top tier really usually go together, but those guys are true difference makers. And so that's what makes this team really, really strong. They still have a strong Dalton Kincaid and Jake Ferguson tight end room, but you can see they aren't necessarily practicing as good of roster construction principles because they have so many of these tight ends down here. They've still got Gerald Everett they're hanging on to, Tyler Conklin, Dawson Knox, Brenton Strange. Like the fact that they have all these guys, okay, they're doing something different with their roster construction. The other thing to note is they only have second round picks in this upcoming draft, so they aren't going to get one of those top 10 guys to really help bolster this starting lineup. And if they end up spending those second round picks on rookies, those are going to be some more dead roster spots for them. So where we try to beat this team is it somewhat comes down to the luck department, realistically. So even a team that looks this good, where they still have Breece Hall and Travis Etienne, they have DJ Moore, Rashee Rice, Devon Achane, like they've got a lot of really, really good pieces, and they even have a little bit of depth like out of Kenneth Walker and Deebo Samuel. Just because they have a really rock solid team doesn't mean that every single week that they're going to be the best. And fantasy football, it comes down to luck. And when we get into playoff time, What's more important is just simply being there in playoffs. You have the kind of team that after getting the 102, whether that's Marvin Harrison or Malik Neighbors, you've got you have a team where I can see the clear advantage for how you're going to win. As long as Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen don't go down, your team is going to be one of the top teams in the league. You very well might be able to get yourself the second place and have that first round bye in the playoffs. And what we see from statistics is that the team that gets the number one seed only wins the championship at like a 37% rate or something like that. Like it's not even that much. And when you look at okay, yes, this is a super team, so maybe it's a little higher. It's not going to be super duper high, like higher than like a 50% sort of thing. So if you're talking this super team only has a 50% chance of winning the championship if it survives the full season, that leaves 50% for you to potentially fill. 50% where your team can go in and they can it, and your team can make a push for the playoffs. Maybe your team's the one that beats the super team. Or maybe your team's the one that makes the championship game when the super team loses to the 4 seed in their first round of the playoffs in the semifinals. Like it especially in a lineup league, it's very easy to fumble a week. Very easy to have CeeDee Lamb has a bad matchup. He's against Sauce Gardner that week, and Amon-Ra St. Brown, he only gets 6 catches for 60 yards, and Puka Nacua has a week where maybe he twists his ankle a little early into it and he's hobbled. Like all of a sudden, all 3 of these receivers that were the players that I was saying, they were the difference makers. They're what makes this team good. They just aren't they aren't the thing that pushes them over the top. It's wide receivers can win you championships. Wide receivers can also lose you championships, especially when it comes to a lineup league, because they're just so volatile week to week. So I tend not to, especially in a lineup league, tend to not worry about what the other teams are. If I have a good, strong team, I know when I have a good, strong team. You have the pieces put together where you're missing a couple things. You're missing that top tier wide receiver. You're it, you're kind of missing the additional running back help, but that's intentional to help with the value. Um, and you're missing a little bit of maybe that wide receiver depth that's not old. Because you could see the Keenan Allen falling apart. You could see Terry McLaurin falling apart. You can see Cortland Sutton, Mike Williams falling apart too. Right now we're counting them as part of your 8 wide receivers, but that could very easily go down to only 2 of those guys are viable as your 8 wide receivers when the season comes. So that's why I was mentioning come up to 8 or 9, because it'll just give you a little bit of extra depth to help you out. And so your team is almost there. It's right at the edge. And so much of fantasy comes down to luck. And that's kind of what I want to impart on you for this team is you have the rock solid foundation of Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts. You don't need to worry about the quarterback position for a long time. And you can focus in on honing those wide receivers, on finding the right managers, the right players that are available to be able to get some wide receivers in that top range. And when you do that, now your team starts to become a monster. It becomes something that is feared. The Cheapy's team, he's got CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, and Puka Nacua, and then he's got all these other players, but his quote-unquote top-tier quarterbacks aren't as top-tier as yours. You can make up with the fact that, yeah, his benches, or his flex spots are DJ Moore and Rashee Rice. He has Deebo Samuel on his bench, but if you've got Jalen Hurts and Josh Allen, you can make up some of that difference. You can have Keenan Allen in your flex, who maybe he's not as consistent as he was this past year, but he can still put up 15, 20-point games. Terry McLaurin, maybe he's not that consistent, but he can still put up some points with whatever rookie they have there, whether it be Drake May, Caleb Williams, Jaden Daniels, whoever. But that's the sort of thing where your team can make up some differences by having that advantage. You want to play the game where your team has an advantage that you can hold over the rest of the league and that you can hold over them for a long time. So ultimately, take a look at what I've said. Look at the holistic, okay, how am I trying to stay alive in this league for a long time? We tend to look at Dynasty in these 1 or 2 year windows. And yeah, if I'm looking at a 1 or 2 year window, swapping out Josh Allen and Jalen Hurts and trying to get the top tier value at wide receiver is the way to go. But you've already mentioned your league doesn't value quarterback as well, as much as they probably should. So turn that back around on them. You have the 2 top tier quarterbacks. Nobody's going to be willing to pay for them. So hold that over the rest of your league. Dominate them with that, and because those are the 2 best quarterbacks, they're both still pretty young, they'll be around for a long time. Try and give yourself as many shots at the championship by letting the rest of your team play the odds. If over the next, let's just say 4 or 5 years, you make the playoffs every single year, and you have a decent chance of winning the championship. Like if, say you're the number 2 seed twice and you're the 3 through 6 seed another 3 times. Well, the 2 seed has, I've shown through some statistical stuff that they win the championship like 30% of the time. And then if you're seeds 3 through 6, it ends up being somewhere around like 10 to 15%. So if we add that up, you're at like a 90% chance of winning a championship in that time. If you add all those, if you look at the expected chance that you win it. And then the leagues that you didn't win it, you have a good chance at finishing second, finishing third. Like you still have those shots in the barrel too. And so it may not be that super dynasty that you're seeing GP build over here, where he's got all the players that it's more on his team has to fumble in order for him to lose. But you can rely on his team fumbling sometimes. Your team does not need to be perfect in order to beat the top tier team. You can rely on that team not being perfect sometimes. So you definitely have yourself in a good spot, and just kind of run it slow. Take advantage of your 102. Get yourself a top tier wide receiver. Take advantage of somebody else in your league that doesn't realize what they have in a top warp difference making receiver, and just kind of let your team ride. Take advantage of proper roster construction. I can tell you listen to our content on that, because you only have 2 tight ends. You have a bunch of backup quarterbacks. You have a ton of backup running backs. And let your team fall as it may. Take advantage of the opportunities it has. Take advantage of the opportunities presented to you by the league. When GP's team, it's not going to be perfect every single year. So when it's not his year, take advantage of it. That's your year. And so ultimately, roll with it. Have fun, and have fun playing Dynasty.